The film kicks off with Ellen, who's standing by the window at night, doing some weird ritual to summon someone. The crazy part is that when she calls out, a shadow actually shows up and tells her, "You woke me up, now you're all mine." Ellen nods in agreement, and just like that, she's whisked away to another world. There, she and this mysterious creature get close, but then out of nowhere, the creature starts torturing her. Just before Ellen can't take it anymore, her eyes snap open back in her own bed. So, fast forward a bunch of years, we see Alan with her husband Thomas. Alan just recently got married. Thomas, who's Alan's husband, is a real estate agent, and today he got assigned by his company to head to Transylvania. He needs to find a house for his clients, Count and Loki. Count and Loki couldn't do it themselves because they're pretty old. Alan didn't want Thomas to go, but he had no choice, so before leaving, he dropped Alan off with his friend Frederick's family. Before leaving, Alan told him that he's been having really scary nightmares lately, and he feels like something really bad will happen if Thomas goes away. But Thomas explained to him that it's just in his head. Alan gave Thomas a locket with his powers in it to remind him to come back quickly. Then, we cut to a mysterious guy making a pentagram with candles and doing some kind of ritual. Who he is and why he's doing this will be revealed later. Anyway, now we see. When Thomas got close to Transylvania, he asked the locals for directions to Count and Locke's castle. Everyone freaked out when they heard him mention it and warned him not to go near them because even saying their names is considered really bad luck around there. That night, Thomas stayed with those same people, and he was jolted awake by some strange noise. When he went outside, he saw a bunch of people carrying a girl on a horse. She wasn't wearing anything, and then the girl got down. While digging up a grave, he stabbed a man in the heart with a dagger, and blood spilled from his mouth. Right then, Thomas woke up, and that's when we realized it was all just a dream. Now that he was awake, he started his journey again. But when he stepped outside, he was shocked to see that the whole village was deserted. It was strange how everyone could just vanish overnight. As he was walking, he ran into a horse cart. Thankfully, he avoided an accident, but he noticed there was no one else around. Maybe this cart had come to get him. He quietly got into the carriage, but as soon as he sat down, he started feeling unwell. Still, he was determined to meet his client somehow. Finally, he had arrived at the counter lock's place. It was really dark everywhere, and he started feeling scared. The counter lock in front of him looked pretty intimidating too. We didn't get to see the counter lock at this moment, but it was clear from Thomas' expression that he was scared of it. The counter lock said to Thomas, "You're really late, and I didn't like that. After this, you'll start calling me my lord." Now, counter lock offers Thomas something to eat. Scared, Thomas flinches when he's in front of him, and he accidentally cuts his finger. Immediately, counter lock grabs his hand and says, "Let me bandage that for you." As soon as he said that, Thomas passed out. After a while, when Thomas came to, there was no one in the castle. Count and Locke were gone, and he got even more freaked out. Then, Counter Locke came back with a contract written in a language Thomas couldn't understand. Thomas wasn't feeling it when Count and Locke told him this was our traditional language, and the contract just said he was buying a house through their company. They told him to just sign it. But since he needed the job, he went ahead and signed it. Thomas only needed to understand his name and Numbers Fira, which was another name for Count and Locke. Why Numbers Fira was on the contract would be revealed later. After signing the contract, Numbers Fira had Count and Locke give Thomas his locket. Thomas thought that maybe if he showed the locket with Alan's hair inside, he'd get it back. But the counter lock didn't let him have it. After a while, Thomas asked for the locket again and requested to leave. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and was totally confused about what was happening. Was it a dream or was it real? He had no idea. At that moment, he noticed a bite mark on his body, which freaked him out even more. Meanwhile, when he turned his nose, he saw something strange about the locket, and it was being talked about in some weird language. He was talking and kept mentioning Alan's name, which was causing Alan to be possessed from across the seas. After doing this, Count Olok comes to Thomas, knocks him out, and starts biting him to drink his blood. It's revealed here that Count Olok is actually a Dracula, a vampire. On the other side, Alan, who had been affected, was possessed by Dracula using his powers. Seeing his condition, Thomas' friend's family got really worried. They called a doctor, who came and checked everything, and they thought that maybe Alan is dealing with some mental issues. After he regained consciousness, he started worrying about how Thomas was doing since it had been a while since Thomas had left, and he hadn't even written him a letter. Meanwhile, Thomas was trying to save himself. When he turned his head, he looked around and tried to escape from his cell. The doctor who came to treat Alan was also shown treating another patient, and that patient is the same one we saw at the start of the movie. He had seen some weird rituals happening around him, like a strange circle being formed. The whole room was filled with bizarre drawings. Yeah. And he was in some sort of pose when he told Dr. Frederick that he was Lord Count and Locke. Right after saying that, he lunged at Dr. Frederick like he was trying to suck his blood. It was clear he was a slave to the Count and Locke, gathering blood from humans for them. At that moment, he was collecting as much blood as he could because he knew Count Locke would be showing up here soon. The scene cuts. We're shown Thomas, who's being rescued by some people. By looking at the marks on his body, they figure out that the one responsible for his condition is none other than Numbers. They start treating him, and as soon as Thomas comes to, he gets up. He feels something strange in his heart. He wants to go meet Alan, but the locals tell him to rest for a bit. But no, he just gets up, determined to meet Alan despite being sick. Meanwhile, we also see Count and Locke locked up in their coffee shop. Thomas has already left for his city, and he's reading something along the way that Ellen, sitting far away, can hear. Meanwhile, that guy who used to worship the Counter Locke realizes that the Counter Locke is now on its way. On a ship heading to Thomas City, we see a bunch of rats starting to wreak havoc. And this chaos is about to spread to Thomas City as well because wherever the Counter Locke goes, it brings plague and sickness. These rats begin to attack everyone on the ship, and one guy starts to understand that these rats are from the Count. They're coming out of the coffin, and the Count tries to open it up and take him out, but the Count and Locke end up grabbing him and beating him up instead. Meanwhile, we see that another doctor has arrived with Dr. Frederick to treat Alan. Alan is now tied up, and she tells the doctor that sometimes she feels like her soul leaves this world and goes somewhere else. Lately, she even knows about things that are going to happen in the future before they do. Sometimes, she just doesn't understand what's happening to her. What's happening to me? I keep hearing voices like someone is talking in my ear, but I can't make out what they're saying. Plus, I have these really scary dreams that always wake me up in a panic. While we're talking, Alan starts feeling unwell, and his body begins to jerk violently. At that moment, Dr. Frederick gives him a strong injection that he doesn't even feel, and they realize that once again, Alan's soul has left this world and gone somewhere else. The doctor believed that Alan didn't have a mental illness, but that he was possessed by some other power. When he told this to another doctor and Thomas' friend, they were totally unwilling to accept what he said. They left, and suddenly, in the middle of the night, Alan came to his senses. As soon as he woke up, he ran to the door and opened it, where he saw Alan passed out. At the same time, it was shown that the ship carrying the Counter Locke had also arrived in bad shape at the city's port, where all the rats were gathered. They start spreading out in the city, and the guy who used to worship the Counter Locke quickly rushes out of his cell to meet it. Meanwhile, Thomas' friend and Dr. Frederick are busy treating Thomas. Day by day, the city's condition is getting worse. Rats have spread disease all over, and people are dying. There's a shortage of food too. And then we hear about the Counter Locke and its slave, where it's saying that it can't force Alan to come along, and it needs to do something about it. Maybe Alan will agree to come with me. The servant says, "As you command." Now, we find out that in Latin, Nosferatu means vampire. That's why Nosferatu was mentioned in that contract instead of Count. Meanwhile, the increasing number of deaths in the city puts Dr. Frederick and all his doctor friends in a tough spot. They check the bodies and find not just rat bites but also marks from human bites. There wasn't even a drop of blood left in the body. Drinking the blood of a whole human isn't something rats can handle. Throughout all this, he wanted to talk to the guy at the Counter Locke, but that dude had already vanished from his cell. That day was the same day that Nos had come back to the city. With each passing day, Thomas started having terrifying dreams, and in those dreams, he tells Alan to stay away from him. That same night, Alan, possessed, gets up from her bed and goes to the window where a shadow comes to meet her. This shadow belongs to no one else. But Numbers was the one who told Alan that Thomas had sold him to Numbers and that he had even signed a contract. Alan wasn't ready to accept this, and honestly, Thomas hadn't sold him to anyone. The contract Numbers got Alan to sign was actually about handing him over to Alan. Now, Numbers tells Alan that he has just 3 days and only one choice. Either he comes to Numbers or he loses his loved ones, meaning Thomas and his family. Numbers also says something really strange. Alan says to her, "You know you're not a whole person and you can't live your life with humans. So just come to me quietly and your life will get easier." In response, Alan tells him, "I love Thomas now and no one else can come into my life at this moment." After all this, suddenly Alan wakes up and we see that this was all just a dream. Next to her, Thomas' friend's wife is lying there and her whole body has been gnawed at by rats, which is really disturbing. It was pretty creepy. In the morning, Frederick was really upset about his wife's death. And here Alan tells him that there are bite marks on his body. Alan realized it was the work of the 9 deadly nights, but she couldn't tell Frederick because he didn't believe in any of this. Then Anne asks Thomas to friends why they don't like her, and one of them replies, "I don't hate you, but I don't buy your childish talk. I think you're just pretending to be crazy." He tells Alan right off the bat that he and Thomas can go home now. Meanwhile, we see Dr. Frederick has arrived at the same place where the Number Spirito's slave used to live. He came here to gather information about Number Spirito, and finally, he finds a book that talks about Mahatma Numbers and his exploits. It mentions that wherever Number Spirito goes, rats and disease spread, leading to death and destruction, completely ruining cities. This chaos continues until the Number Spirito are dealt with. When he can't find the person he needs, he remembers Alan's illness, meaning he realized that the danger is coming for Alan. Now, both Alan and Thomas are at risk, so he rushes to tell them. Meanwhile, Thomas, who was starting to feel a bit better, sees the terrible state of the city and decides to leave. At this point, Alan decides to share the biggest truth of his life with Thomas. He tells him that Nosferatu has already come to the city and it's only after him. "I had some psychic powers that allowed me to connect with beings other than humans and talk to them. Using those powers, I summoned Nosferatu." This is the same scene we've seen at the start of the movie. She tells me that before I got married, I made a contract with Nosferatu where I basically handed myself over to him. But then I met you, fell in love with you, and married you. In all of this, I forgot my promise to Nosferatu, and now he wants me to fulfill that promise. As soon as he starts sharing all this, Alan's health takes a turn for the worse. His body starts shaking, and his eyes roll back. You can tell he's completely possessed. Despite seeing Alan in that state, Thomas doesn't stop caring for him. He doesn't seem to care about anything else. He's still living and still loves Alan. He pulls Alan in for a tight hug and promises him that he'll never leave. They end up spending a long time together like that. Meanwhile, Dr. Frederick is working on research to end sleepless nights. They realized there was no other way to end the Nosferatu nights except through Alan, meaning no one but Alan could kill the Nosferatu. The next day, they heard that Thomas' friend's wife and their child had also been killed by the same curse. At the funeral, both Thomas and Alan were there, where Dr. Frederick told Thomas that it was time to end the Nosferatu nights. They planned to open the Nosferatu's coffin during the day and stab its heart to finish it off, after which they would meet with Alan. They know that Nos has a big role to play in Alan's life at night. He told Alan that he needs to finish his unfinished work, and in the meantime, I'll keep Thomas involved. In reality, Dr. Frederick's plan was different from what he was discussing with Thomas. Things were a bit more complicated. The next day, we see Thomas, Dr. Frederick, and another doctor going out to find Nos's coffin. And they also learn that Thomas' friend had committed suicide. This news hit Thomas really hard. They had to move on from here because they needed to complete their mission. Meanwhile, back home, it shows that after Thomas leaves, Ellen gets all dressed up like a bride. Finally, Thomas and his friends find Nosferatu's coffin. They step inside the coffin and try to kill Nosferatu, but when they open it, they discover that Nosferatu isn't even there. Instead, it was his servant. And we know that Nosferatu went wherever he was called, which was actually by Ellen. Alan went to Nosferatu, and as soon as he got there, Nosferatu says, "I want to fulfill my unfinished promise. I'm yours now." Hearing this, Alan embraces him and starts drinking his blood. While Nosferatu is drinking Alan's blood, he gets lost in the moment. And at that same time, morning arrives. The sun rises, and Nosferatu doesn't even realize it. Alan stays by the window with Nosferatu, and as soon as the sunlight hits Nosferatu, things start to change. He starts burning up and slowly dies right there. The moment he dies, Alan is freed. As soon as she lies down on the bed, she dies too because all her blood has been drained by Nosferatu. When Thomas comes home, he finds both Nosferatu and Alan's bodies on the bed, and seeing that completely shatters him. It was shown that as soon as Nosferatu died, all of Baba's influence in the city vanished. Rohit also mysteriously disappeared from the city, and with that, the movie ends. Hey,